You're listening to Unlocking Vulnerability, a podcast produced by Helen, helping you better understand consumer vulnerability.
Hello, I'm Helen and welcome to Unlocking Vulnerability. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome my special guest, Sally Pearce. Sally has worked in the insurance industry for over 40 years, first as an underwriter, often managing frontline customer service teams. In 2000, she joined the newly formed Financial Ombudsman Service, providing direction and technical guidance for new work streams as its jurisdiction broadened and its workforce grew. Sally left the FOS in 2006 and set up and managed a number of regulatory complaint teams. For a time, she worked with Lloyd's of London, helping to set up their standards review framework and self-assessment process. In 2014, Sally set up her own business, Conduct Matters Limited. She has worked with a number of firms, including Lloyd's, managing agents, designing frameworks and developing culture to ensure compliance with FCA and Lloyd's conduct risk and customer requirements. This work includes working with boards and reviewing risks, roles, responsibilities, and the effectiveness of board and committee structures. Sally also creates and delivers conduct risk training, including board training and e-learning. Wow, there's a lot of information there, Sally. You've obviously been a very busy person. It's wonderful to have you as a guest on my podcast.
It's great to be here, Helen. It's really nice. Always nice to talk to you about the issue of vulnerability and conduct issues in our market. So yeah, great to see you.
Wonderful, thank you. So do you want to start by giving a brief introduction to yourself?
Well, you said quite a lot of it, haven't you, Helen?
I have, really.
I suppose the thing I would like to say is that 20 years of underwriting, I absolutely loved it. But my move to work for the Financial Ombudsman, working in dispute resolution, was a real game changer for me. And I've loved it ever since then. It's been all about helping the customer, improving the customer experience. And my position on that is I work with clients in creating frameworks and designing products and helping them understand how their products can work for customers, seeing it from the perspective of the customer. And I've loved every minute of it.
That's fantastic. It's brilliant. And it is all about the customer, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yeah.
So as we both know, the Financial Conduct Authority has been doing a lot of work on vulnerability in recent years, and obviously last week it updated the proposed set of proposals of treating vulnerable customers fairly. A hot topic at the moment. So what are your thoughts on the guidance and what's it going to mean for firms moving forward?
Well, I love the guidance, I'll say that. I'll come out. I'm not going to sit on the fence with this one. I think it's great. For most of my clients, I would say they've historically found this quite a struggle. And the reason is because the FCA, as we know, is primarily principles based. So it tells you what it wants you to do, but it doesn't give you very much guidance about how you have to do it. And the firms that I work with, insurance firms, they like a bit of guidance. They like to be directed in certain ways. Generally, as I say, all my clients, all the people I work with in the market want to do the right thing. They're really keen to do it. They want good cultures. They want to treat their customers fairly. They just like more guidance. They just like more structure to what they're told to do. I think it's going to be great for them. I think it's going to also come as a shock for many businesses, many firms in the insurance industry and maybe other industries within financial services who don't realise they have vulnerable customers. They probably thought for years, we don't sell to this vulnerable group, we just sell to the general public. And I think we're seeing from this paper from the FCA that that's no longer an issue. Everyone who sells to consumers, even if they're wholesale and they're using other service providers, need to understand and manage vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely key, isn't it? And of course, the FCA mentioned the 4 drivers of vulnerability: health, capability, life events, and resilience. So that ultimately affects everybody, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a very fluid state, vulnerability. These 4 events can happen to most of us at any time, and sometimes without warning, as we're seeing in the current pandemic. It's not unusual. We're seeing people who wouldn't previously have been considered vulnerable becoming vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely key. So why do you think that the FCA is now putting such a priority and importance on vulnerability? Why is it top topic at the moment?
Well, I think there's two reasons for this. I think, firstly, firms haven't been doing it well enough. And that I thought that was very clear in the FCA report. They said it's not just responses to vulnerability questions, but when they go out and do any kind of market work and they come back and they look at what they're finding, they're picking up elements of vulnerability that just aren't being addressed by firms. So firms just aren't doing it well enough. So we have to be blunt, we have to accept that. The other reason, I think, is because so many of us can be vulnerable. You know, you just talked about the 4 drivers, Helen. Well, the FCA report says that 46% of the UK adult population show at least one of these indicators of vulnerability. And that was before COVID-19. So we know it's going to be higher. Think about that. That's half, at least, I would say now, at least half of the people that you talk to as consumers are going to be vulnerable in some form. It's a growing area. We have an ageing population as well. We know the extent of vulnerability is growing, and the FCA is very concerned about that and has been for some years.
I was quite surprised at the 46% because it's gone down slightly from the 2017 Financial Lives survey, hadn't it, where they said 50%. But obviously that was pre-COVID, so I think possibly now, yes, significantly higher than the 46%, isn't it? And of course then they're going to be having vulnerability across all the drivers.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the individual figures they gave totted up to about, it was more than 100, wasn't it? It was kind of, you've definitely got numbers of people within there who have 2 or 3 of those drivers, and you're going to, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you get one life event, and sometimes you think actually these all come in threes, don't they? One thing happens, and then of course another thing happens, and then of course one thing happens, and then it leads into further vulnerability as well, because it's pushing you into, if you lose your job, it could then push you into financial challenges, could give you relationship difficulties. It can really impact all of the different situations and circumstances just by one life event. Can really
absolutely.
Impact.
Yeah, and the FCA has made the point as well that sometimes the behaviour of the firm can trigger a vulnerability. So the way an insurance firm deals with a claim might trigger some vulnerability. In my time when I was at FOS, we used to see quite a few tricky situations where you have a small business that makes an insurance claim, and because the claim isn't dealt with promptly, the business goes bust. And we are seeing a lot of that at the moment with the issue on the BI claims, where food businesses have had to close because of COVID-19, and maybe they've got some support from the government, but for lots of them, I think they're going to come out of this maybe without a business.
That's scary, isn't it? And then that's their livelihood, isn't it? That's their financial, their household finances as well, isn't it? And the whole detrimental effect on that.
Well, it has a big impact when a business goes bust, doesn't it? It's not just the owners of the business who've probably taken on lots of debt to finance the business, confidently thinking they were doing well, not seeing this around the corner. Then you've got all the employees, and then you've got the local community that relies on that business. And it's a huge knock-on effect, and this is going to affect a lot of people's exposure to vulnerability.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that businesses like to label and segment customers, so especially for sales and marketing purposes, we put them into little categories, don't we? Should this be the way forward with vulnerable customers too?
Well, the FCA didn't like this, did they? I mean, that was, again, another clear message from the report. What they've seen firms doing is labelling people as either being potentially vulnerable or not vulnerable. Effectively, it's an on-off switch, and I see this with a lot of, I'd say, clients, but when they become clients, this doesn't happen, I can assure you. I see this with a lot of firms who tell me, oh, we have a vulnerability indicator, and you say, well, what is that indicator? And it's an on-off switch. It's an indicator. It's just a tick box. And what's that telling you about the customer? And this is exactly what the FCA has said. They're not happy about firms just using this on-off indicator. Partly because it doesn't tell you very much, it just tells you there's something. Also because, as we've already discussed, the fluid nature of vulnerability. I lost my parents last year, and I had to deal with their estate, and at that point in my dealings with the banks, I moved up that spectrum of vulnerability. I would say I probably ticked their box of vulnerability for a short while. The FCA is very concerned about that firms have been doing this and really using it as a way I would suggest to say, oh, we don't have exposure, because if you've got a tick box on your system, you only know someone's vulnerable if they've told you they're vulnerable or you've identified they're vulnerable. The default is not vulnerable. So it's just not been good enough. So the FCA is clearly not happy with this. So we have to think about this differently. Firms have to think about how they're going to identify people who need help or need something a bit different from the standard. Firms tend to create very standard, generic processes. And again, the FCA has told us many times there has to be flexibility within these processes to deal with individual customer needs. And frontline staff have to be authorised and empowered to make those changes. So we have to rethink how we're labelling people. I'm not suggesting we take the indicator away completely. I'm suggesting, which I think is where the FCA is going with this, is that we have to identify people's needs, and we have to be better at identifying people's needs, and we have to understand, do they need a certain way of communicating? Do they need documents written in certain languages? For example, capability is a good example. As someone who has an issue with capability maybe doesn't have an education that means they can always understand their policy wordings. So one way of getting around that might be to have a system where you explain the policy cover in a different way. Maybe you give them an FAQ, or you give them an audio system, or some other different way of understanding the policy, but you have to identify these people. So just having someone as vulnerable won't tell you what they need. You need to know what they actually need. I think one of the really good examples in the FCA report that I really liked was the one about the bank, where if somebody elderly takes out a bank account or has a bank account, the bank goes to them and says, is there a second contact point? So that if you go into hospital, if you become ill, we can talk to someone and we know that's someone that you've authorised, and they can deal with that for you. I thought that was a brilliant idea, and I'd love to see insurers do that. They get the date of birth, normally for security purposes when they're setting up the policies. So why not say to people, is there a second contact point? It's a very simple question, and I think that would make life a lot easier for a lot of people.
Yeah, I saw that case study and thought that was really, really powerful. And in some respects, it could be very simple and cost effective to just implement that. It doesn't need 6 months of a board meeting and planning and everything to actually integrate that into the process.
It's just asking a question, isn't it? I suppose the most complex area of it is going to be in terms of protecting the vulnerable from making sure that the authority is going to the right person. So I would say that they would probably have to be quite limited in how the authority worked. It wouldn't be like a power of attorney, would it? So I think there'd have to be some rules around it, and how you record it is crucial, because the other issue that did get raised in the report is the issue of data security as well. So, if you record someone as vulnerable, or you make a record that they've got an illness or whatever it is you want to record about them, that sits in your data, that becomes, I would say, sensitive data. I think they have to be really careful about what's recorded.
And I think as well, the guidance said about even just the term vulnerable, and actually that's what us as businesses use to label customers that may need additional or different support. But actually that's not how the customers label themselves.
It's a good one, isn't it? Because the FCA suggested it shouldn't be used externally anymore, didn't they? Yeah. They talk about it being an internal term and not used externally, or not. So you shouldn't say to a customer, are you vulnerable? Or I'll make a note you're vulnerable. Just a simple, I'll make a note of your needs. Are you happy for me to record on the system that you would like us to do X, X and X? Person says yes or no. That's the simple way of doing it. So there will need to be some work on about how this information is recorded and what's done with it and how it's shared, because of course another customer frustration you see is when they speak to one person and then they speak to someone in a different team and they didn't see that information. So you have to go through it all again, repeat the whole situation. There is definitely an issue there for how this information is recorded in an efficient, safe way.
And of course you get that with different departments as well, isn't it? That maybe a customer's rung up, they've told the contact centre staff that there's a change of situation, or maybe somebody's passed away, and then it doesn't get to another department, and then a letter goes out and it hasn't taken any notice of what those changes were. Maybe they've sent out a letter addressed to the person who has passed away, and you see that so often, don't you?
I was going to say, that's a story you see that quite a lot, don't you, when someone sends a letter to a deceased person, and that's really upsetting. Firms need to be better at sharing this information internally.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously the entire document is 109 pages. It was hard going. I had to do it in 3 sittings. But I think it was really valuable, and I agree with you that actually it is a really clear, concise document now. So what do you think firms should do now that they've got this information?
Well, number one, read it. Definitely read it. And then read it again, and maybe read it again. So the FCA has a consultation out, so do respond to the consultation if you've got concerns. If you've got concerns, tell them, because I don't know if anyone's ever looked at previous consultation papers that the FCA issues, but they always respond to what people say when they challenge these papers. So it's a really good thing to do. You will get an answer in the final paper. They like to know what people are saying about it. So definitely do that. I would say the most important thing to realise with this, though, that this is a principles-based regulatory regime. You should already be doing this. This is just guidance. So I would look at this from the perspective of, how can we do this now? What do we need to think about changing now? Don't wait for the FCA to say what exactly the guidance is going to be, because guidance is coming. It will look very, very similar to what's come out now. I don't expect there'll be many changes to it, but you're going to have to move really quickly on it. So I'd get to it quickly. Get out there, do your impact assessment, look at what you need to do to improve. Look at some of the examples. There's some really, really good examples. We talked about the bank one. I like the training ones as well. So, for example, the dementia training, where people go on dementia awareness courses, and it's a culture thing as well. If you've got people in the workplace who've done that kind of training, they have a better understanding of what's going on in the world around them. They can better speak to people. They can better understand people. Frontline training is really key, but it doesn't have to be just the formal training. It can be about the broader issues as well. So that's really important. Obviously, from my point of view, I do lots of work with clients on designing products and designing services. So I'm expecting lots of calls for help on whether they need to look at their design processes again to make sure that they are identifying the needs of the customers. Again, in my experience, lots of firms don't reach out to their customers as often as they should to get that identification. Whether it's a focus, I mean, I love focus groups. I think they're a really good way of getting a group of people in a room and saying, what can help you with our product? You know, how can our product work for you? What kind of service do you want? And I guarantee you, if you get a group of anyone in a room and ask them if they like telephone lines, which has press 1 for this and 2 for that and 3 for that 90% of them will tell you no, but still have the focus group.
Definitely. And it was interesting that you said about the word culture, because I think that was one of the key words that was sort of almost part of the vein of the whole document and the whole guidance. Is actually, it's just embedding that culture, isn't it? And then what they're wanting is that this isn't going to be a tick box exercise. It's not just about, okay, read the paper, put it in place, do what it says, tick the box, and then forget about it. What they're wanting is that it's just embedding it into the culture, that it just becomes second nature, that actually people just don't think about it. It just happens.
I agree completely. It's about making these things second nature. And I think one of the things that you and I talk about a lot is active listening skills, don't we? I know that's part of your training. And it's one of the things that I first learned when I qualified as a mediator. It's active listening is so important. And once you learn active listening, it's a bit addictive, actually, because it's such a powerful thing to do. And it's so great for the customer. You sit there and you listen and they talk to you. It's that kind of thing. It's those kind of skills that you want frontline, but it's also an understanding from the top, from the senior managers, from the directors, from your board members, understand the value of treating these vulnerable customers so well, treating all customers well, but to understand the value of understanding vulnerability, it's not just about what the regulator tells us to do. We know at least half of the population has a vulnerability element. It's on that spectrum of risk. Well, we're all on the spectrum of risk, but at least half of them are pushing towards the riskier end of it. It makes commercial sense. If you don't give your vulnerable customers the service they need, and you don't sell them a product they understand, it creates more work. They end up buying products they don't understand, that don't satisfy their needs. They end up hassling you. You get phone calls, you get letters, you get complaints. Just get it right first time.
It will just affect the bottom line as well. And businesses
Absolutely.
will grow, the whole reputation. There are so many more benefits.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that brought all my questions to a close really for today. But I mean, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I believe in this sphere of work, and I believe for all the work that I do, that it's about people wanting to work in an industry where the right thing is done. It's about wanting to work somewhere where there is kindness around you, where you treat other people how you want to be treated, and you are therefore treated like that. I think this is a huge part of it. We all need to be a bit kinder. We all need to think about what other people want, what other people need. Wouldn't the world be a wonderful place?
That's wonderful. Yeah, perfect, Sally. And that fits in nicely with one of my emails that I sent out today, is actually we have the opportunity to just make a difference, help people and make a difference in their lives. So yeah,
Absolutely.
Kindness goes a long way.
Absolutely. Yeah. Why wouldn't we want to?
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. That's some fantastic points that you've shared there today. So thank you so much for being my guest today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Helen. As ever, I've loved our chat.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. And if you haven't had a chance to read the 109-page Financial Conduct Authority's guidance on treating vulnerable customers fairly, you can find it on their website. And I will put a link into the episode details as well. Please do get in touch with either Sally or myself if you want to have a proper conversation about how you can put this into practice within your organisation. And you can email me at info@helenpettifer.com, and Sally's details are in the episode description. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unlocking Vulnerability. Please take care of yourself, stay safe and well. And remember to subscribe to my podcast and leave a review. You can also follow me on Twitter at @HPettiferTrain. And I look forward to you joining me on my next episode.